When Daniel Cortez signed the foreclosure papers on the old Brennan dairy farm for $380, the county clerk looked at him like he'd just bought his own tombstone. The property hadn't produced milk in 23 years, its barns collapsing under the weight of too many Illinois winters, its fields choked with thistle and wild grass that grew taller than a man. The main house leaned westward, as if the whole structure had given up fighting gravity years ago. But Daniel wasn't buying potential. He was buying shelter for himself and his 9-year-old son, Leo, because the rent on their apartment was 2 months overdue and his welding job at the plant had vanished when the factory closed without warning. Sometimes desperation doesn't look like opportunity, it just looks like the only door left open. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel stood in the gravel driveway of the Brennan farm on a gray November afternoon, his truck's engine ticking as it cooled in the silence. Leo pressed against his side despite the cold, small fingers gripping the fabric of Daniel's worn jacket. The farmhouse rose before them like something from a nightmare, 2 stories of peeling white paint and boarded windows, surrounded by acres of neglected pasture where dairy cows had once grazed. A rusted mailbox still hung by the road, the name Brennan barely visible through layers of oxidation and bird droppings. The name meant nothing to Daniel, just another piece of forgotten history in a county full of dead farms. Leo's grip tightened. It looks haunted. Daniel couldn't argue with that assessment. The dairy farm looked like exactly what it was, abandoned, dangerous, and definitely not the kind of place a responsible father would bring his child to live. But responsibility was a luxury he could no longer afford. The math was brutally simple. $380 for the entire property versus $900 a month for the apartment they could no longer keep. The farmhouse had walls and a roof that mostly held. That made it a palace compared to the alternative, which was sleeping in his truck at rest stops. "It's just old," Daniel said, forcing confidence into his voice that he didn't feel. "Old doesn't mean bad. Old means it survived this long. They built things solid back then." Leo looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding for 9 years old. He'd developed that expression over the past 18 months since his mother, Carla, had died in a car accident on Route 47. No warning, no chance to say goodbye. Just a phone call from the state police that turned Daniel's world into something unrecognizable. Some losses don't heal, they just become part of who you are. The county clerk had given Daniel a single key, brass worn smooth by decades of use. It felt heavy in his palm as he approached the front door, a massive oak thing that had probably been beautiful once but now hung crooked on hinges crusted black with rust. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, and the door groaned open, revealing darkness beyond that smelled of dust, mildew, and something organic he couldn't identify. Time, maybe, concentrated and left to rot. The interior was worse than he'd imagined. What little November light filtered through gaps in the boarded windows revealed a living room frozen in decades-old decay. Furniture sat beneath sheets that had turned gray with dust. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips, exposing water-stained plaster underneath. A staircase rose into darkness on the left, several steps missing their boards entirely. The floor creaked ominously under Daniel's weight, protesting after years of bearing nothing heavier than rats and raccoons. Leo stayed close as they explored, his breathing quick and shallow in the stale air. The living room connected to a kitchen where ancient appliances stood like rusted monuments to obsolescence. A farmhouse sink, cracked and stained. A wood-burning stove, door hanging open to reveal ash that might have been cold for 20 years. Cabinets with doors that fell off their hinges when Daniel touched them. "Can we really live here?" Leo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel surveyed their new home with what he hoped looked like determination. "We'll make it work. See that room upstairs? Once we clear it out, get some heat going, it'll be fine. It's an adventure." "I don't want adventures anymore," Leo said softly. The words hit Daniel harder than his son probably intended. Leo used to love adventures. Before Carla died, before the factory closed, before their life became a series of increasingly desperate compromises, Leo had been fearless. He'd explored every park, climbed every tree, asked 1,000 questions about how the world worked. Now he flinched at changes, clung to routine, and looked at the world through eyes that expected disappointment. Daniel knelt to his son's level, ignoring the way the floor groaned beneath him. "I know things have been hard. I know you didn't ask for any of this. But I promise you, we're going to be okay. This place might not look like much now, but it's ours. Nobody can kick us out. Nobody can raise the rent." Leo studied his face with that too perceptive gaze. "You promise?" Daniel had learned the hard way that promises to children carried weight you couldn't always bear. But what else could he offer? "I promise we'll try our hardest." It wasn't much of a promise, but it was honest. Leo seemed to accept it, nodding slowly before turning his attention back to exploring their strange new home. They spent the remaining daylight hours doing reconnaissance. Daniel tested light switches, discovering to his relief that electricity still functioned, though several outlets sparked when he tried them and would need repair. The plumbing proved more problematic. Water flowed brown from the kitchen faucet, running for several minutes before clearing to something approaching drinkable. The toilet in the downstairs bathroom worked, barely, which Daniel counted as a significant victory. The upstairs revealed 3 bedrooms, all stripped of furniture except for rusted bed frames and broken dressers. The master bedroom had a hole in the ceiling where rain had leaked through for years, creating a patch of black mold that made Daniel's throat itch just looking at it. They'd avoid that room entirely. The smallest bedroom, at the back of the house, seemed the most intact. Windows that still held glass. Floors that felt solid. A door that actually closed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the winter sun began its early descent, Daniel started hauling their possessions from the truck. They didn't have much. 3 garbage bags of clothes, a box of Leo's books and drawings, Daniel's welding tools, sleeping bags and blankets, a camping stove, and a cooler with the food they'd managed to buy at the discount grocery store on the way. It took 4 trips to get everything inside, each one emphasizing just how little they'd accumulated in 9 years of Leo's life. He chose the back bedroom for their living space. It faced east, which would catch morning sun, and the walls felt solid when Daniel knocked on them. He swept out the worst of the debris, dead leaves and insect husks and things he didn't look at too closely, then laid out their sleeping bags on the floor. The camping stove went in one corner, their meager food supplies in another. Leo arranged his books on the windowsill with careful precision, creating order in chaos. "It's like camping," Daniel offered, watching his son organize their new space. "Camping is supposed to be temporary," Leo replied without looking up. Daniel didn't have a response to that. Instead, he focused on practical concerns. Heat would be the immediate challenge. The house had radiators throughout, connected to an ancient boiler system in the basement that Daniel suspected hadn't functioned in decades. For tonight, he'd brought an electric space heater that would at least keep their room from freezing. Tomorrow, he'd investigate the boiler and figure out if it could be salvaged or if they'd need alternative solutions. They ate dinner sitting on the floor of their new room. Sandwiches made from day-old bread and cheap lunch meat, the kind of meal that filled stomachs without satisfying hunger. Leo chewed slowly, his eyes wandering around the bare walls. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, turning the windows into black mirrors that reflected back the single bare bulb Daniel had screwed into the ceiling fixture. "Tell me about Mom," Leo said suddenly. The request surprised Daniel. Leo rarely asked about Carla anymore. The first 6 months after her death, Leo had asked constantly. Where was she? Was she watching them? Did she know how hard things had gotten? Daniel had fumbled through explanations that satisfied neither of them, eventually settling on variations of "she loved you very much and she's not hurting anymore." After a while, Leo stopped asking. Daniel had thought that meant acceptance. Now he wondered if it had just been retreat. "What do you want to know?" Daniel asked carefully. Leo picked at his sandwich. "Do you think she'd be mad at us? For living here?" The question cut deeper than Daniel expected. Would Carla be mad? The woman who'd worked double shifts as a nurse to help them save for a down payment on a real house? The person who dreamed of a backyard where Leo could play safely, a garage where Daniel could set up a proper workshop. She'd wanted stability, security, a life that looked like the ones other families seemed to have so easily. I think she'd understand, Daniel said honestly. Your mom knew what it meant to do what you have to do to survive. She grew up poor, worked her way through nursing school. She'd see this as temporary, a step towards something better. Is it temporary? Leo asked, his voice small. Daniel wanted to say yes, wanted to promise this was just a brief stop on their way to recovery. But he'd learned not to make promises he couldn't keep. I don't know. But we'll work hard. I'll find welding jobs, save money. We'll fix this place up and see where we are. Leo absorbed this quietly, then returned to his sandwich. They finished dinner in silence that felt companionable rather than tense. Daniel cleaned up their minimal dishes while Leo prepared for bed, changing into pajamas and brushing his teeth with water from a bottle since the bathroom was too cold to linger in. When Leo returned, Daniel tucked him into his sleeping bag and read to him from one of the books they'd brought, a battered copy of Hatchet that had been Leo's favorite before everything changed. Leo fell asleep halfway through the chapter, his breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of childhood rest. Daniel continued reading softly for a few more minutes, reluctant to stop this small piece of normalcy. Finally, he closed the book and simply sat there, watching his son sleep in their strange new home. The farmhouse made sounds at night. Wood creaking, what might have been animals in the walls, the wind finding gaps in the structure and whistling through. Normal sounds for an old building, Daniel told himself, even as they raised the hairs on his neck. He'd grown up in apartments and rental houses, not sprawling rural relics. The sheer isolation of the place, the darkness beyond the windows that seemed absolute, the knowledge that the nearest neighbor was probably miles away, all of it felt overwhelming. Daniel checked the space heater to ensure it was functioning safely, then settled into his own sleeping bag. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds and the hard floor beneath him. At some point in the early morning hours, exhaustion finally won. He woke to pale winter light filtering through dirty windows and Leo already awake, sitting cross-legged on his sleeping bag and drawing in his sketchbook. Daniel had bought him that sketchbook and colored pencils 4 months ago, back when he'd still had steady work. Leo had filled half of it already with elaborate drawings that looked nothing like their actual life. Imaginary places where things made sense. "Morning," Daniel said, his voice rough from sleep and cold air. "Morning," Leo replied without looking up. "The house makes really weird sounds at night. Old places do that. It's just settling. Nothing to worry about." Leo nodded but didn't look convinced. Daniel couldn't blame him. In daylight, the dairy farm looked less menacing but no more welcoming. Just old, vast, and fundamentally abandoned. Daniel made them breakfast on the camping stove. Instant oatmeal and instant coffee for himself, the bare minimum to start the day. As they ate, he outlined his plan. First priority was assessing the boiler system. If it could be repaired, they'd have heat throughout the house. If not, he'd need to figure out alternatives before the real winter cold arrived. Second priority was making their living space more habitable. Deep cleaning, finding or building furniture, making it feel less like camping in a ruin. "Can I explore while you work?" Leo asked. Daniel hesitated. The dairy farm was large, potentially dangerous with its collapsing structures and uncertain floors. But keeping Leo confined to one bedroom seemed cruel, and he couldn't watch him constantly while trying to assess the property. "You can explore the house," Daniel compromised. "But stay away from the barns outside, and stay where I can hear you if you call." "Deal?" "Deal," Leo agreed readily. They spent the morning in parallel tasks. Daniel descended to the basement, a dark cave accessed by narrow stairs that creaked alarmingly under his weight. The boiler sat in the corner like a monster from another century, a massive cast iron beast covered in pipes and valves that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Daniel knew basic maintenance from his years working factories, but this antique equipment was beyond his expertise. He'd need a specialist, which meant money he didn't have. Meanwhile, Leo's footsteps echoed overhead as he wandered through the house. Occasionally, he'd call down, reporting discoveries. A room with farming magazines from the 1980s. A bathroom with a clawfoot tub. A closet full of old coats that smelled like mothballs in time. Daniel was making notes about the boiler, trying to determine what might be salvageable, when Leo's voice cut through the house with unusual urgency. "Dad! Dad, come quick!" Daniel was up the basement stairs faster than he thought possible, heart hammering. Leo's tone hadn't been panic exactly, but something close. He found his son standing in what had probably been a pantry off the kitchen, staring at the back wall. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked, scanning for danger. "Nothing's wrong," Leo said, his eyes bright with excitement. "But look at this." He pushed against what appeared to be a wooden shelving unit built into the wall, and the entire section swung inward with a soft click, revealing darkness beyond. "It's a secret door," Leo whispered, as if speaking loudly might close it again. "I was looking for food and leaned against the shelf and it moved." Daniel approached cautiously, examining the mechanism. The door was cleverly designed, camouflaged to look like permanent shelving, operated by a hidden latch disguised as a shelf bracket. Beyond the doorway, darkness suggested a space larger than a simple storage closet. "Stay here," Daniel instructed Leo. He pulled out his phone, activating its flashlight, and stepped through the hidden door. The space beyond wasn't a room. It was a tunnel. Narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, with walls of rough-cut stone and a ceiling so low Daniel had to duck. The phone's light revealed the passage extending into darkness, sloping downward at a gentle angle. The air smelled different here. Cooler, damp, with a mineral quality that suggested deep earth. "What is it?" Leo called from the doorway, unable to contain his curiosity. "It's a tunnel," Daniel said slowly. "I think it goes under the property. Under the fields maybe." Why would someone build a tunnel under a farm? It was an excellent question. Daniel had no answer. He took a few careful steps forward, his phone light sweeping across the stone walls. Someone had put serious work into this. The tunnel was well constructed, reinforced with timber beams every few feet, built to last. This wasn't some amateur project. This was professional work, hidden deliberately. Leo slipped past him despite the earlier instruction to stay put, his eyes huge as he took in the passage. "Can we explore it?" Daniel's practical side said no. Unexplored tunnels on property he'd just purchased, tunnels that disappeared into darkness toward unknown destinations, were objectively dangerous. But his curiosity was stronger than his caution. Why would someone build this? Where did it go? And why hide the entrance so carefully? "A little way," Daniel compromised. "Just to see where it leads. But you stay right next to me." They descended into the earth together, father and son, following a secret path that had been hidden for reasons Daniel couldn't yet imagine. The tunnel continued for what felt like 100 yards, sloping steadily downward, the air growing colder with each step. Then, abruptly, it ended at a metal door. Heavy steel, industrial grade, with a wheel lock like something from a bank vault. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the wheel. It resisted at first, rust and time making it stubborn, then slowly began to turn. The mechanism groaned, echoing in the confined space. After 3 full rotations, something inside the door clicked. Daniel pulled, and the vault door swung open, revealing a room beyond that made his breath catch in his throat. The space was maybe 15 feet square, carved from solid bedrock and reinforced with concrete. But what commanded Daniel's attention wasn't the construction. It was the contents. Metal shelving lined every wall, stacked with wooden crates and metal boxes. In the center of the room sat a table, and on that table lay a leather journal, positioned as if waiting for someone to find it. Daniel stepped inside, Leo pressed against his side. He approached the journal carefully, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. The leather was old but well preserved, protected by the cool, dry air of the underground chamber. He opened it to the first page, where a single line of text was written in faded ink. If you're reading this, you bought what the government auctioned and found what they never could. Congratulations. You've earned what's inside. Daniel's vision blurred as he turned to the next page, where detailed entries began. Not farming records, as he might have expected, but something else entirely. Dates, amounts, locations, and transactions that painted a picture Daniel struggled to process. The journal belonged to someone named Vincent Brennan. And according to its pages, Vincent hadn't been a dairy farmer at all. He'd been something else entirely. Something that explained the hidden tunnel, the vault door, and the fortune that was apparently now sitting in boxes all around them. Daniel spent the next 4 hours locked in that underground vault while Leo sat at the tunnel entrance, entertaining himself with his sketchbook. The journal contained 83 pages of Vincent Brennan's meticulous handwriting, each entry dated and detailed with the precision of a man who understood that documentation meant survival. What Daniel read rewrote everything he thought he understood about the property he'd purchased for less than a week's wages. Vincent Brennan hadn't been a dairy farmer. That much became clear within the first dozen pages. The man had been a facilitator, what the journal called a logistics coordinator for Chicago operations during Prohibition and beyond. The dairy farm had been a front, legitimate enough to avoid scrutiny while serving as a way station for goods moving between Chicago and points west. Alcohol during Prohibition, certainly, but other commodities too. Things Vincent never specified directly, writing only in codes and euphemisms that still conveyed their illegal nature. The vault had been Vincent's insurance policy. Between 1947 and 1963, he'd systematically skimmed from operations, hiding portions of cash and valuables in this underground chamber he'd constructed himself with the help of exactly 2 trusted associates, both of whom Vincent noted had died of natural causes years before his own death. The journal provided an inventory, meticulous and organized. Cash in various denominations, bundled and vacuum-sealed to prevent deterioration. Gold bars and coins. Jewelry taken as payment for services Vincent never fully described. Bearer bonds issued by corporations that might or might not still exist. The final entry was dated August 12, 1963, 3 weeks before Vincent's death according to the date carved on the family headstone Daniel had noticed near the property line. The handwriting had grown shakier but remained legible. My sons believe this farm is theirs by blood. They have no understanding of what built this operation. No respect for the risks taken. No gratitude for the comfort they've enjoyed without question. They see the land as an asset to liquidate, the farm as a burden to shed. They'll sell it the moment I'm gone and never look back. I've made provisions. Let time separate the patient from the entitled. Whoever finds this will have purchased what my bloodline abandoned. May they prove worthier than my children. Daniel read that final entry 3 times, recognizing the bitter echo of a father disappointed in his legacy. Vincent had hidden his wealth not from law enforcement, though certainly that too, but primarily from his own sons. He'd engineered a system that would only reward someone who actually occupied the property long enough to discover its secrets. The sons had apparently sold the farm in the early 70s according to county records Daniel vaguely remembered from the foreclosure paperwork. 40-plus years of the Brennan family slowly liquidating their inheritance without ever finding what truly mattered. And now that inheritance belonged to Daniel Cortez, a 34-year-old welder who'd bought the property in desperation, not ambition. Daniel climbed back through the tunnel to find Leo had drawn an elaborate picture of the secret door, complete with question marks and arrows pointing into darkness. His son looked up as Daniel emerged, expression curious but patient. "Did you find treasure?" Leo asked. The directness of the question startled a laugh from Daniel. "Maybe. I found information. Tomorrow we'll come back and see if what the book says is actually here. Can I help look?" Daniel considered this. Involving Leo meant exposing him to knowledge that could be dangerous, but keeping secrets from his son felt wrong. They only had each other now. Partnership meant trust. "Yeah," Daniel said. "You can help. But Leo, this has to stay between us. Nobody can know what we found." Not yet. Not until I figure out what we're supposed to do. Is it bad? The treasure? It's complicated, Daniel said honestly. The man who hid it didn't get it through honest work. But he's been dead 60 years, and his family sold this place without caring about his legacy. So I don't know if that makes it ours or if we're supposed to tell someone. Who would we tell? That's the problem. I don't know. They returned to the vault the next morning, Daniel carrying better flashlights he'd purchased with the last of his cash at the hardware store in town. The clerk, an older man who'd introduced himself as Pete Holloway, had asked casual questions about the dairy farm that felt less innocent in retrospect. Folks say old Vincent Brennan was connected to some interesting business back in the day, Pete had said, his tone carefully neutral. Course, that's just rumors. Daniel had kept his expression blank. Every old property has rumors. Now, standing in the vault with proper lighting, Daniel could see the full scope of what Vincent had accumulated. 23 wooden crates stacked along one wall, each marked with dates spanning nearly 2 decades. 16 metal lockboxes on shelves opposite, secured with padlocks that had long since corroded. The cash was vacuum-sealed in plastic that had yellowed but held, visible through the transparent material. Stacks of $100 bills, 50s, 20s. Old denominations with designs Daniel recognized from history books. Leo helped him inventory the first crate. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were gold bars the size of Daniel's fist. 5 of them, each stamped with purity marks and serial numbers. Daniel had no idea what they were worth, but holding them made his hands shake. Are we rich? Leo asked, watching his father's face. Daniel stared at the gold in his hands. Rich. 48 hours ago, he'd had $300 to his name and no prospects beyond hoping for work that might never come. Now he was looking at wealth he couldn't begin to calculate. And it had come from the hidden fortune of a man who'd built his life around crime. I don't know what we are, Daniel said quietly. They spent 3 days cataloging the vault's contents, working in secret while the November cold deepened outside. Daniel counted just over $7.3 million in cash, accounting for inflation and assuming the old bills could be exchanged. The gold totaled another $2 million at current market prices. The bearer bonds were the wild card, potentially worth tens of millions if they were still valid, potentially worthless if the issuing companies had dissolved. But the real shock came on the 4th day when Daniel opened the last metal lockbox and found something that made his breath stop. Diamonds. Not jewelry, but loose stones in small velvet bags, each stone carefully wrapped and documented. Vincent's journal had mentioned valuables taken as payment, but Daniel hadn't imagined this. Hundreds of diamonds, ranging from small chips to stones the size of his thumbnail. He had no expertise to value them, but even his untrained eye could see they were genuine, high quality. The total, if Daniel's rough estimates were anywhere close to accurate, exceeded $85 million. The number was incomprehensible. It represented more money than Daniel could earn in 20 lifetimes. It could solve every problem he'd ever faced, provide Leo with every opportunity imaginable, rewrite their entire future. It could also destroy them. Daniel understood enough about sudden wealth to know that explaining this kind of money invited questions he couldn't answer. Where did it come from? How did he find it? Could he prove legitimate ownership? The cash was old enough to be difficult to trace, but diamonds had serial numbers, bonds had documentation, gold bars left paper trails. And Vincent Brennan's criminal connections, whatever they'd been, might have left descendants or associates who'd taken interest in a fortune suddenly surfacing. That night, after Leo was asleep, Daniel researched Vincent Brennan on his phone. The man appeared in newspaper archives from the 40s and 50s, always peripherally. A dairy farmer questioned in connection with bootlegging operations but never charged. A property owner whose farm had been searched twice by federal agents who found nothing. A man photographed in the background of pictures featuring Chicago mob figures, never prominent, never identified in captions. Vincent had been careful, skilled at avoiding direct connection to crimes while clearly facilitating them. And he'd been smart enough to hide his take where no one would find it, building a vault under a working farm, concealing the entrance so well it had survived decades of ownership changes. Daniel was still reading when his phone rang. Unknown number, Chicago area code. He answered cautiously. Daniel Cortez? A man's voice, rough and direct. Who's asking? Name's Frank Brennan. Vincent's grandson. I understand you bought my grandfather's old farm. Daniel's stomach dropped. Brennan. A descendant. Calling him 5 days after he'd discovered the vault. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. That's right, Daniel said carefully. Can I help you with something? I'd like to meet with you, Frank said. Discuss the property. My grandfather's legacy. There are things about that farm you should probably know. Legacy code for the hidden wealth Vincent had deliberately kept from his family. Pete Holloway's casual questions suddenly seemed less innocent. Word had spread that someone now owned the dairy farm, and Vincent's descendants were circling. I'm not looking to sell, Daniel said. I'm not looking to buy, Frank countered smoothly. Just to talk. I'm driving down tomorrow. Be there around 10 in the morning. Frank, Daniel said, testing the name. What exactly do you want to talk about? A pause on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, my grandfather was involved in certain business activities. The family has always suspected he kept assets hidden on the property. Assets that weren't part of his estate when he died. There it was. Frank knew, or suspected, about Vincent's hidden fortune. Daniel could deny everything, claim ignorance, but something in Frank's tone suggested the man wouldn't be easily dismissed. 10 o'clock works, Daniel agreed. After the call ended, Daniel sat in the dark bedroom, listening to Leo's peaceful breathing and the old farmhouse's nighttime sounds. Tomorrow would bring complications he wasn't prepared for, a confrontation between blood inheritance and found fortune, between what was legal and what might be right. He thought about Vincent's final journal entry. Let time separate the patient from the entitled. But time hadn't separated anything. Chance had. Desperation had. Daniel had bought the cheapest shelter he could find and stumbled into someone else's carefully constructed revenge against his own family. Daniel pulled out Vincent's journal again, reading by phone light. One entry from 1959 stood out. Frank visited today with his brother Michael. Both boys, 20 and 18 now, full of ideas about modernizing the operation. They see the dairy farm as a relic, something to update or abandon. They have no understanding that the farm's ordinariness is its greatest asset. Invisibility is survival. But they want visibility, want recognition, want to be known as successful rather than actually being successful. They'll ruin everything I've built the moment they have control. Vincent had been right. His sons had sold the farm within a decade of his death. And now their children were coming to claim what had been deliberately hidden from their parents. Frank Brennan arrived exactly at 10, driving a black SUV that looked aggressively out of place against the farmhouse's rural decay. He emerged dressed in what Daniel recognized as expensive casual wear, designer jeans, and a leather jacket that probably cost more than Daniel's truck. Late 50s, Daniel guessed, with silver hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Leo watched from an upstairs window as Daniel descended to meet their visitor. He'd told his son to stay inside during the conversation, a precaution that felt increasingly necessary as Frank approached with the measured stride of someone assessing property value. Mr. Cortez, Frank said, extending a hand. Appreciate you agreeing to meet. His handshake was firm, aggressive. Daniel noted he wore a gold watch that caught the morning light and a ring that might have been his grandfather's, thick gold with an engraved crest. Mr. Brennan, Daniel replied. You said you wanted to discuss your grandfather's legacy. Please, call me Frank. He turned to survey the farmhouse, his eyes scanning with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. My grandfather built something here. Not just the dairy operation, but something else. The family has stories, you understand. Things he was involved in. Wealth he supposedly accumulated that was never accounted for when he died. Your grandfather was a dairy farmer, Daniel said neutrally. Frank's jaw tightened. My grandfather was a lot of things. The dairy farm was legitimate, mostly. But there were other operations. During Prohibition, after, connections to Chicago organizations that preferred discretion. Vincent was good at discretion. Very good. He turned back to Daniel. The family has always believed he kept assets hidden on this property. Cash, valuables, insurance against the day when his business connections might turn dangerous. My father and uncle searched for years after Vincent died. Never found anything. Eventually concluded the stories were fantasy. But you don't think they were fantasy, Daniel said. Frank studied him carefully. A week ago, I would have said yes, just family legends. Then Pete Holloway called me. Said someone had bought the old farm, young guy with a kid, asking about excavation equipment and heavy-duty flashlights. Same kind of purchases you'd make if you were planning to search a property thoroughly. Pete talks too much, Daniel said. Pete knew my grandfather, Frank said. Worked for him back in the day, though he'll deny it now. He keeps tabs on the property out of loyalty to Vincent's memory. And when he called me, I started thinking. Maybe the stories were true. Maybe Vincent really did hide something. And maybe whoever bought this farm for pocket change is about to get very lucky. Daniel met his gaze steadily. What exactly are you asking for? I'm asking that if you find family assets on this property, you remember they belong to Vincent's bloodline. You purchased the land and buildings, sure. Nobody disputes that. But anything my grandfather hid here, that was never part of any sale. That remains family property. Daniel had anticipated this argument. That's not how property law works. I bought this land and everything on it. Anything found on the property belongs to me. Legally, maybe, Frank conceded. But morally, you're talking about my grandfather's wealth. Money he earned, right or wrong, and hid to protect his family even though we were too stupid to find it. The fact that my father sold this place without discovering what was here doesn't change the fundamental ownership. And the fact that your grandfather hid it specifically so your father wouldn't find it. Daniel asked quietly. Does that change the fundamental ownership? Frank's expression shifted, surprise replacing calculation. What do you mean? Daniel realized his mistake too late. He'd revealed knowledge he shouldn't have. But backing down now would only make things worse. I found your grandfather's journal, Daniel said. The one he kept about his operations. I know exactly what he thought of his sons and why he hid what he hid. For a long moment, Frank simply stared. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a sound without humor but genuine. You actually found it. The vault everyone whispered about. My father spent 20 years looking and found nothing. You've been here less than a week. My son has a talent for finding things that don't want to be found, Daniel said. Frank's expression shifted again, becoming harder. Then you know where it is. You know what's there. I know what might be there, Daniel corrected. I haven't verified anything yet. It was a lie. Frank didn't need to know about the diamonds currently sitting in boxes beneath the farmhouse, or the gold, or the staggering amount of cash. Mr. Cortez, Frank said, his tone becoming less friendly. Daniel. Let me be clear about something. My grandfather's business connections ran deep. Some of those connections have long memories. If Vincent's fortune suddenly surfaces after 60 years, people will ask questions. People you don't want asking questions. Is that a threat? It's a warning, Frank said. My grandfather protected his assets by being invisible. You try to spend that money, convert those assets, you become visible. And visibility in this situation could be dangerous for someone with a 9-year-old son to protect. The mention of Leo made Daniel's blood run cold. Don't talk about my son. I'm not threatening your boy, Frank said, raising his hands. I'm warning you. There are people who'd see that fortune as theirs by right of having been connected to the operations that generated it. My grandfather's former associates, their children. You stumbled into something complicated. The Volkovs sent a package. A child's toy with a note saying Sophia would be next if I didn't surrender the Eastern Territory. Horror crawled up my spine. They threatened a 6-year-old? They threatened my 6-year-old. The distinction was important, the fury in his voice barely contained. Which means they've signed their own death warrants. Luca, you can't. I can and I will. He gripped my shoulders. This is why I told you to stay out of my business, Maya. This is the part you can't stomach, can't understand. But it's necessary. Killing them is necessary. Protecting my daughter is necessary. His eyes were hard, unyielding. And if that requires removing the Volkovs from existence, then that's what happens. No negotiation, no mercy, no second chances. And what does that make you? A father. The answer was simple, absolute. Everything else is secondary. Before I could respond, his phone rang. He answered in Italian, his expression darkening with each word. When he hung up, his jaw was set in grim determination. They're at the harbor. All 3 brothers, plus their security. He turned to Marco. Gather the men. Full tactical gear. I want this finished tonight. Luca, wait, I grabbed his arm. There has to be another way. This will just create more enemies, more violence. There is no other way. He pulled free, his expression closing off. This is my world, Maya. The world you chose to stay in. You don't get to ask me to be merciful to men who threaten my child. I'm asking you not to become the monster they think you are. I became that monster the day Isabella died and I couldn't protect her. His voice was raw, stripped bare. The day I failed my family. I won't fail again. Not Sophia. Not you. He kissed me hard, almost bruising, a kiss that tasted of goodbye and promises and rage. Then he was gone, Marco and the guards following, leaving me alone in the safe room with Sophia and the weight of what was about to happen. I pulled Sophia close, her small body warm and trusting against mine. On the monitors, I watched Luca and his men pile into vehicles, armed and ready for war. This was the reality of loving a man like Luca Costello, watching him walk into violence, knowing he might not come back, understanding that my presence in his life had made him both more human and more dangerous. Maya? Sophia's hands moved against my arm. Is Papa going to be okay? I looked down at her worried face, saw the love and fear there, and knew I couldn't lie. I don't know, sweet girl. But he's strong and smart and he loves you very much. That has to be enough. She nodded, settling against me. He loves you too. I can tell. My throat tightened. How can you tell? The way he looks at you. Like Mama used to look at him. She signed with simple, devastating honesty. Like you're his whole world. Tears burned my eyes as I held her tighter, both of us waiting in the reinforced silence for Luca to either come home or prove that love couldn't survive in a world built on violence and blood. The monitors showed empty grounds, quiet streets, the calm before whatever storm Luca was about to unleash. And I realized with terrifying clarity that I'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love with a man who might die tonight defending his daughter. Defending me. The waiting was its own form of torture. 4 hours felt like 4 lifetimes. Sophia had fallen asleep against my shoulder, exhausted by fear she didn't fully understand. I held her in the artificial light of the safe room, my eyes never leaving the monitors that showed nothing, just empty grounds and silent streets that revealed none of the violence I knew was happening somewhere in the city. When the phone on the wall finally rang, I nearly dropped Sophia in my haste to answer it. Maya. Luca's voice, rough and strained but alive. We're coming back. Open the door only for Marco's code, 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. No one else. Understand? Are you hurt? My voice cracked on the question. I'm fine. We're all fine. Just, he stopped, and I heard something in the background. Sirens maybe, or shouting. We'll be there in 20 minutes. Stay alert. The line went dead before I could ask more. I gently laid Sophia on the couch, covering her with a blanket, then positioned myself by the door with one of the panic buttons Marco had shown me earlier. If anything went wrong, if someone tried to breach the safe room, I'd flood the house with security and lock us in until help arrived. 17 minutes later, the knock came. 3, pause, 2. I opened the door to find Marco, his face splattered with blood that clearly wasn't his. "Where's Luca?" I demanded. "Coming." He had to. Marco glanced at Sophia's sleeping form. "Handle some final details. He'll be here soon." "What happened? Is everyone okay?" "We lost one man. Angelo." The Volkovs had more security than expected. Marco's expression was grim. "But it's over. All 3 brothers are dead, their operation dismantled. The threat is neutralized." The clinical way he described death, like it was just another task completed, made my stomach turn. But beneath the revulsion was relief so profound it made my knees weak. Luca was alive. He was coming home. "Thank you," I managed. "For keeping him safe." Marco's eyes softened fractionally. He wasn't worried about himself, Miss Reyes. The whole time, every decision, every move, it was about getting back to you and Sophia. I've worked for Mr. Costello for 10 years, and I've never seen him fight like that. Like a man with everything to lose. Before I could respond, Luca appeared in the doorway. His suit was ruined, jacket gone, shirt torn and bloody. There was a gash across his cheekbone, bruises forming on his jaw. But his eyes, when they found mine, they blazed with life and relief and something so intense it stole my breath. Maya. Just my name, but the weight of it carried everything he couldn't say with Marco present. I crossed the space between us in 3 steps, my hands hovering over his injuries, afraid to touch him and cause more pain. "You're hurt." "It's nothing." He caught my hands, holding them against his chest where I could feel his heart hammering. "Is she sleeping?" "Unharmed. Safe." I looked up at him, seeing the fear drain from his expression. "You kept your promise." "Always." His thumb stroked across my knuckles. "Marco, take the guards upstairs. Sweep the house again, then establish a perimeter. I want double security for the next week." "Yes, sir." Marco hesitated. "Angelo's family, already handled." I called his wife from the car. "Full benefits, pension, college fund for his kids. And I want our best lawyer on retainer for them. If they need anything, ever, it's taken care of." Luca's voice was firm but tired. "Angelo died protecting my family. That debt doesn't expire." After Marco left, Luca and I stood in the harsh fluorescent light, reality settling between us. He'd killed 3 men tonight, maybe more. Had orchestrated violence with the same careful planning he brought to everything else. And I'd waited for him, hoped for him, loved him despite knowing exactly what he was doing. "You should hate me right now," he said quietly. "For what I did. For what I am. I should." I touched the cut on his cheek gently, my fingers coming away bloody. "But I don't. I can't. And that terrifies me more than anything else. Maya, let me finish. Let me help you navigate it." "Help me by taking how much?" Daniel asked. Frank hesitated, then seemed to decide on honesty. "Half. You keep half for finding it. I take half as Vincent's heir. We split everything down the middle, and I use my connections to make sure the money can actually be used safely. Otherwise, you're sitting on a fortune you can't touch without putting yourself in danger." Daniel studied him, trying to gauge manipulation versus genuine concern. Half seemed reasonable on the surface, but it also meant surrendering $40+ million to someone whose claim was based on blood rather than effort. "I need time to think," Daniel said finally. "How much time?" "I don't know. A few days at least." Frank nodded slowly. "I can give you a week. But Daniel, understand something. I'm not the only one who'll come looking. Pete Holloway isn't the only person in this county who remembers Vincent and his operations. You start asking questions about converting old currency or selling diamonds, word spreads fast. And some people who hear that word won't be as reasonable as me. After Frank departed, Daniel stood in the farmhouse's driveway, turning the conversation over in his mind. The threat had been real, if indirect. Vincent's fortune represented more than just money. It represented connections to criminal operations that might still have interested parties decades later. Leo emerged from the house, having apparently watched the entire conversation from his window perch. Was that man angry? Frustrated, Daniel said. Maybe worried. He thinks he deserves something we found. Does he? Daniel wished he knew how to answer that. Frank was Vincent's grandson, direct bloodline to the man who'd accumulated the hidden wealth. But Vincent had deliberately engineered things to keep his family from finding it, had written explicitly that he wanted the fortune to go to whoever proved patient and worthy enough to discover it. It's complicated, Daniel said, the same answer he'd given before. It always seemed to be complicated. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the vault alone, standing among the boxes and crates that represented both salvation and potential disaster. $85 million. Enough to ensure Leo never worried about money again. College fully funded. Healthcare secured. Every opportunity imaginable. Everything a father could want for his son. But Frank's warning echoed in his mind. Visibility could be dangerous. The money had been hidden for reasons beyond just keeping it from Vincent's sons. It represented proceeds from criminal operations that might still have stakeholders, people who'd view its sudden appearance as theft from their legacy. Daniel opened Vincent's journal again, searching for guidance. One entry from 1961 stood out. Received word today that Anthony Castellano died in federal prison. Tony was the last of the old guard, the men who understood that real power comes from invisibility. The new generation wants flashy cars and public profiles. They're fools who'll destroy themselves. I've been careful to separate my holdings from any direct connection to current operations. What I've hidden is mine alone, earned through years of careful service. Let my sons prove themselves worthy of finding it. If they can't, let it stay buried until someone else proves worthier than my blood. Vincent had been clear. The fortune was meant for someone worthy, not someone entitled. But who decided worthiness? Vincent himself, through his deliberately obscure hiding place? The law, through property rights? Blood inheritance? The man who desperately needed the money versus the man whose grandfather had earned it through crime. Daniel had no answers, only the weight of knowing that whatever choice he made would define him and Leo's future. Keep everything and risk Frank's warnings coming true. Split it and acknowledge a claim he wasn't sure Frank deserved. Turn it all over to authorities and watch it disappear into legal proceedings that might take years while he and Leo continued to struggle. The land keeps secrets, Carla had said once, years ago when they'd driven through rural Illinois talking about maybe buying property someday. She'd grown up on a farm, understood that soil remembered everything that happened on it. Every crop, every storm, every person who'd worked it. The land doesn't judge, she'd said. It just holds what it's given. Daniel looked around the vault, this secret chamber carved into bedrock, holding Vincent's life's work. The land had kept this secret for 60 years, waiting for someone to find it. Now that someone was Daniel, and the land offered no guidance about what came next. Only the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more complications, more impossible choices, and the certainty that whatever path he chose would change everything. Daniel spent the next 3 days in a kind of suspended reality, going through the motions of making the farmhouse livable while his mind churned through impossible calculations. He repaired the downstairs bathroom, patched holes in walls, cleared debris from rooms they'd need to use. Leo helped without being asked, the two of them working in companionable silence that felt heavier than usual, as if his son understood something fundamental had shifted even if he didn't know the details. On the evening of the third day, Daniel found Leo sitting on the front porch despite the cold, his sketchbook open but empty. His son stared out at the overgrown fields that stretched toward the tree line, where the last of the November light was fading into purple dusk. Daniel sat beside him, the old boards creaking under his weight. "Whatcha thinking about?" "Mom," Leo said quietly. Whether she'd know what to do about the treasure. The admission surprised Daniel. Leo rarely volunteered thoughts about Carla anymore. "What do you think she'd say?" Leo considered this, his face serious in that way that made him look older than 9. "I think she'd say you should do what helps us but doesn't hurt us worse later. She always said that about money. That getting it wrong could hurt more than not having it." "Smart woman, your mom." Leo nodded. "Do you know what to do yet?" Daniel looked out at the same fields his son had been studying. The land that had kept Vincent's secrets for 6 decades, that had watched families come and go, that remained constant while everything else changed. "I think so. But I want to ask you something first. If we kept all the money, all 85 million, we could leave here. Buy a real house, somewhere nice. Good schools, safe neighborhood. Everything you deserve." Leo's expression didn't change. But it might not be safe. The man who hid the money, he was involved with dangerous people. His grandson says those connections might still matter. And morally, I'm not sure keeping everything is right. Vincent wanted someone worthy to find it, but he was also Frank's grandfather. Blood means something. Leo absorbed this quietly, then asked, "What do you want to do?" "I want to keep enough to make our lives stable. Put you through college, make sure we never sleep on floors again. But not so much that we become targets. And I want to share some with Frank, not because he deserves it by blood, but because it might be the only way to keep us safe." "That sounds fair," Leo said simply. "It sounds like giving away tens of millions of dollars." "We didn't have it 3 days ago," Leo pointed out with 9-year-old logic. "So we're not really losing anything. We're just getting less than we could have." Daniel pulled his son close, grateful for the simplicity of that perspective. "When did you get so wise?" "Mom taught me," Leo said quietly. "Before she died. She said sometimes the best choice is the one that lets you sleep at night." Daniel called Frank the next morning and arranged another meeting. This time he suggested neutral ground, the diner on the edge of town where truckers stopped for coffee and the breakfast special hadn't changed price in a decade. Frank arrived looking less polished than before, tired lines around his eyes suggesting he'd spent the past few days wrestling with his own complications. They sat in a booth near the back, coffee steaming between them untouched. Daniel had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but now that the moment arrived, the words felt inadequate. "I found everything," Daniel said without preamble. "The vault, the cash, the gold, the diamonds, the bonds. Your grandfather was more successful than even the family stories suggested." Frank's breath caught. "How much?" "By my rough estimate, 85 million. Give or take a few million depending on the bonds and diamond valuations." "Jesus," Frank whispered. He'd clearly suspected significant wealth, but the number was beyond what he'd imagined. "That's generational money. That changes everything." "It could," Daniel agreed. "Or it could destroy everything. Which brings me to why I asked you here. I've been thinking about what you said. About visibility being dangerous. About your grandfather's connections having long memories." Frank leaned forward, his full attention on Daniel. "I've been thinking about that too. Made some calls to people who knew my grandfather's associates. Most of them are dead or too old to care, but there are children, grandchildren. People who might view that fortune as part of their family legacy too, especially the Chicago families Vincent worked for." "So what do we do?" Daniel asked. Frank studied him carefully. "We? You're not telling me to take a walk?" "I'm proposing a partnership," Daniel said. "Not 50-50 like you suggested. But not nothing either. I keep the majority because I found it, because I need it, and because your grandfather engineered things specifically so people like me would be rewarded. But you get enough to matter. Enough that you have incentive to use your connections to keep both of us safe." Frank's expression remained neutral. What percentage are you offering? 20%, Daniel said. 17 million, give or take. Enough to change your life. Enough that you'll work hard to make sure the remaining 68 million I keep doesn't attract dangerous attention. The number hung between them. Frank could argue for more, threaten to expose the fortune to authorities or dangerous associates. But something in his expression suggested relief rather than anger. 20%, Frank repeated. For doing what exactly? For being the public face if one becomes necessary, Daniel said. For using your knowledge of your grandfather's world to help convert the assets safely. For running interference if the wrong people start asking questions. And for honoring your grandfather's legacy in ways his sons never did. Frank sat back, processing this. You thought this through. I've got a 9-year-old son to protect. I don't have the luxury of not thinking things through. Fair enough, Frank said. He extended his hand across the table. 20%. I'll handle the conversion logistics, use old family connections to make sure the right people know this money is accounted for and spoken for. It'll take time, maybe years to do it safely, but we'll both come out of this intact. Daniel shook his hand, feeling the weight of the agreement settle over him. Part relief, part resignation, part something that felt like wisdom earned through desperation. They spent the next week working out logistics. Frank knew people who could convert old currency, appraisers who could value diamonds without asking uncomfortable questions, lawyers who specialized in quietly managing windfalls that required discretion. The process would take time, possibly years to fully convert everything safely, but Frank had resources Daniel lacked and connections that made the impossible merely difficult. The cash was easiest. Frank arranged for it to be exchanged through a network of currency dealers who specialized in old denominations, spreading the transactions across months to avoid triggering reporting requirements. The bonds required more patience, verification that the issuing companies still existed, legal processes to claim them. The diamonds would be sold gradually, a few at a time through estate sales and private auctions where their sudden appearance wouldn't raise questions. Frank handled most of this, true to their agreement, while Daniel focused on making the dairy farm livable. He hired local contractors to repair the roof, replace windows, update the electrical system. The farmhouse slowly transformed from ruin to home, not beautiful but solid, functional, safe. Leo thrived in ways Daniel hadn't seen since Carla's death. The space of the farm, the project of restoration, the security of knowing they'd never be evicted again, all of it seemed to unlock something in his son. He started exploring the property, cataloging the old dairy equipment in the barns, sketching plans for what the fields could become. He made friends at the small rural school Daniel enrolled him in, brought them home to explore the mysterious old farm with secret tunnels and hidden history. Daniel watched his son's transformation with quiet gratitude. This was what the money meant, not luxury or status, but the simple freedom for a child to be a child again. 6 months after finding the vault, Daniel received the first substantial payment from Frank's conversion efforts. $3 million, deposited into an account Frank had helped him establish through a trust that provided legal distance and tax efficiency. Not the full $68 million Daniel would eventually receive, but enough to change everything immediately. He paid off every debt they'd accumulated, medical bills from Carla's accident, credit cards maxed out during the desperate months after her death, the foreclosure judgment that had forced them here. Then he set up education trusts for Leo, accounts that would guarantee his son could attend any college without worry, pursue any dream without financial limitation. The rest he invested carefully, creating income streams that could sustain them without depleting the principal. Nothing flashy, nothing that would attract attention. Just quiet, steady wealth that meant Daniel never had to take a job he hated, never had to choose between rent and groceries, never had to tell his son no because they couldn't afford it. Frank visited quarterly, combining business updates with what became an unlikely friendship. He'd grown up hearing stories about Vincent but had never understood his grandfather until reading the journal Daniel eventually shared with him. The bitterness of a man disappointed in his legacy, the careful planning of someone who valued patience over entitlement, the complicated morality of a criminal who genuinely believed he was providing for his family even as he hid wealth from them. You know what I keep thinking about? Frank said during one visit, standing with Daniel in the renovated farmhouse. My grandfather spent his whole life building something he knew his sons would destroy. He was right, but it must have been lonely being that right. Knowing your own children would squander what you'd earned. Maybe that's why he hid it, Daniel said. Not to punish them, but to preserve something of himself for whoever came next. Someone who'd appreciate the work instead of just expecting the reward. Frank nodded slowly. My father talked about this farm sometimes before he died. Always with regret. He knew he'd made a mistake selling it, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. Pride destroyed what my grandfather built. And now we're rebuilding, Daniel said. Different purpose, different vision, but the same fundamental drive. Making something that lasts. 3 years after purchasing the dairy farm, Daniel stood in the renovated barn he'd converted into a welding workshop. The space was organized and clean, equipped with professional tools purchased with Vincent's fortune. He'd started taking small jobs from locals, word spreading that the man at the old Brennan place did quality work at fair prices. Nothing large enough to draw attention, just enough to stay connected to the craft he loved and the community he'd become part of. Leo, now 12, spent afternoons in the workshop with him, learning to weld, asking questions about metal and heat and the satisfaction of building things with your hands. He'd grown tall and confident, the haunted look that had defined him after Carla's death finally replaced with something that looked like peace. Tell me about the tunnel again, Leo said, working on a practice weld Daniel had set up for him. Why Grandpa Vincent built it. He wanted insurance, Daniel explained, watching his son's technique improve with each attempt. He worked with people who were dangerous, and he knew someday that danger might come looking for him. The tunnel was his escape route, and the vault was his guarantee that even if everything went wrong, he'd protected something. Did everything go wrong? Not the way he expected, Daniel said. The danger never came, but his sons sold the farm anyway. So in a way, he lost what he built. But in another way, the vault did exactly what he designed it to do. It outlasted the people who didn't appreciate it and rewarded the people who did. Us, Leo said simply. Us, Daniel agreed. That evening, Daniel walked the property alone, something he did most nights after Leo went to bed. The fields were still overgrown, wild grass and thistle reclaiming what had once been pasture. He thought about hiring someone to clear them, plant crops, make the land productive again. But something stopped him. The wildness felt right, like the land needed time to rest after decades of being worked and then abandoned. He walked to the small family cemetery near the property line, where Vincent and his wife were buried beneath weathered headstones. Daniel had cleaned the site months ago, pulling weeds and resetting stones that had tilted with time. He visited regularly, though he wasn't sure why. Some kind of gratitude, maybe, or recognition that his fortune was built on Vincent's careful planning. Thank you, Daniel said quietly to the grave. For building something that lasted. For being patient enough to let the right person find it. The November wind moved through the trees that bordered the cemetery, carrying the smell of earth and coming rain. The land had secrets still, Daniel knew. Corners of the property he hadn't explored, old buildings he hadn't searched. But he was no longer desperate to find them. Vincent's vault had given him what he needed. Everything else could remain hidden until time decided to reveal it. He thought about Carla sometimes, wondered what she'd make of how their lives had turned out. Would she approve of Daniel keeping fortune earned through crime? Would she worry about the example it set for Leo? Or would she understand that survival sometimes meant accepting complications, that providing for your child meant making choices that weren't perfectly clean? She'd understand, Daniel decided. Carla had grown up poor, worked her way through nursing school, understood that life rarely offered simple choices between right and wrong. She'd see this as Daniel doing what he had to do to protect their son, and she'd forgive the moral gray areas because the alternative was worse. Frank called that evening with news. The last of the bearer bonds had been successfully liquidated. After 3 years of careful work, Vincent's entire fortune had been converted to liquid, usable wealth. Daniel's final share came to $61 million after taxes and Frank's percentage. More money than Daniel could spend in 10 lifetimes if he lived modestly, enough to ensure Leo never worried about money and had resources to build his own legacy. "It's done," Frank said, his voice carrying relief and something like closure. 3 years of work, but we did it safely. No one came asking questions. No one knows where it came from. Vincent would have approved. Daniel thanked him and ended the call, then sat in the quiet farmhouse feeling the weight of completion. He'd stumbled into this property desperate and broke, found a fortune hidden by a man he'd never met, made choices that would define the rest of his life. And now it was finished. The money was real, accessible, protected. He went upstairs and stood in Leo's doorway, watching his son sleep like he'd done countless times. All the desperate choices, all the unlikely discoveries, all the careful negotiations with Frank about money and legacy and doing right, all of it had led to this moment. A sleeping child safe and secure. A farmhouse brought back to life. A future built from hidden wealth and patient planning. The land will remember, Daniel thought, echoing Carla's words from years ago. It'll remember Vincent's bitter planning and his son's abandonment. It'll remember Daniel's desperate purchase and Leo's accidental discovery. The land didn't judge any of it, just held the stories like it held the crops and the rain and the seasons that passed without concern for human drama. Daniel closed Leo's door quietly and descended to the kitchen, where he'd hung a photograph Frank had given him. Vincent Brennan in his 50s, standing in front of the dairy barn when it was new, his expression stern but not unkind. The man who'd built this farm as a front, who'd hidden a fortune in anger at his children, who'd engineered a system that rewarded patience over entitlement. "Thanks for the inheritance," Daniel said to the photograph. "We'll try to do right by it." Outside, the November wind picked up, carrying the promise of winter. The farmhouse creaked and settled, old wood adjusting to new purpose. Somewhere beneath the fields, the empty vault waited in darkness, its secrets finally spent, its purpose finally fulfilled. Daniel turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to his own bedroom, the one he'd renovated with care and furnished with real furniture instead of sleeping bags. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new opportunities to prove himself worthy of the fortune he'd found. But tonight, he allowed himself something rare and precious. Tonight, he allowed himself to feel like maybe everything was going to work out after all. 5 years moved across the dairy farm like seasons, each one leaving its mark in ways both visible and profound. The property that had stood as a monument to abandonment now hummed with quiet purpose. Daniel had transformed the main barn into his welding workshop, taking jobs that interested him rather than ones he needed. The old dairy equipment stood as sculpture now, rusted art Leo had convinced him to preserve as memory of what the place had been. Leo turned 17 that spring, grown tall and thoughtful in ways that reminded Daniel of Carla. He developed an interest in architecture, spent hours designing theoretical improvements to the farm's layout. Daniel kept his drawings in a folder in the farmhouse office, next to Vincent's journal, which he'd never returned to the vault. Some things deserve to be remembered in daylight rather than hidden in darkness. Frank visited less frequently now, his own life transformed by his share of Vincent's fortune. He'd written a book about his grandfather's era, not revealing the vault but documenting the Chicago connections and rural operations that had defined that generation. The book had done surprisingly well, establishing Frank as an authority on Prohibition-era Illinois. "You created something remarkable here," Frank said during his spring visit, surveying the property. "My grandfather built this place to hide things. You've turned it into something that reveals things. Truth, maybe. Or just the possibility of starting over." Daniel wasn't sure about that, but he appreciated the sentiment. "It's just a farm where people work. Same as it ever was." "No," Frank corrected gently. "It's a home built on secrets that turned into blessings. There's a difference." Maybe there was. Daniel had certainly never planned anything profound. The farm had simply evolved through necessity and patience, becoming something neither Vincent nor his descendants had imagined but that somehow honored the original builder's spirit. On a warm June evening, Daniel and Leo stood at Vincent's grave as they did every year on the anniversary of finding the vault. It had become their private ritual, acknowledging the complicated inheritance that had changed their lives. Think he'd be happy with what we did?" Leo asked. Daniel considered the question seriously. Vincent had been bitter, disappointed in his children, desperate to preserve something beyond his blood. Happy might be too simple. But I think he'd understand. We didn't squander what he built. We used it to build something new. Leo nodded, then asked the question Daniel had been expecting for years. "When I go to college, will you stay here?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Would Daniel remain on this property that had saved them, or would he move on now that Leo was becoming independent? "I think so," Daniel said. "This place feels right. Like the land has more stories to tell if I'm patient enough to listen." "Mom would like that," Leo said quietly. "She always said you were good at listening." They stood in comfortable silence as the sun descended toward the tree line, painting the overgrown fields in gold and amber. The land that had kept Vincent's secrets for 60 years, that had witnessed Daniel's desperate purchase and Leo's accidental discovery, that had held their fortune while they learned what to do with it. The dairy farm had been many things over its history. A legitimate business. A criminal front. An abandoned ruin. And now something new again, a home built on hidden wealth and patient choices, a place where legacy meant building forward rather than looking back. Daniel had stumbled here in desperation 5 years ago, buying shelter because he had no other options. What he'd found was more than fortune. He'd found purpose, stability, and the space for his son to grow into someone Carla would be proud of. He'd found Frank in an unlikely partnership built on shared need rather than blood. He'd found himself, the man he'd become when forced to make impossible choices about money and morality and doing right. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Leo asked one more question. "Do you think we'll ever tell anyone? About the vault, about Grandpa Vincent, about all of it?" Daniel considered this. The story would make headlines if it ever became public. Mobster's fortune discovered by desperate father. But publicity meant attention, questions, complications they didn't need. "Maybe someday," Daniel said. "When we're both old and it's just history. But for now, I think we keep it quiet. Some stories are meant to be private." Leo accepted this with the maturity he'd developed over 5 years of carrying secrets. "Our story. Our story," Daniel agreed. They reached the farmhouse as darkness fell, lights from inside casting warm rectangles across the porch. Home, in every sense that mattered. Not perfect, not without its complications, but theirs. Built on Vincent's hidden legacy but shaped by their own choices, their own patient work, their own understanding that worthiness wasn't inherited, it was earned through showing up every day and trying to do right. The land would remember all of it, Daniel knew. Vincent's bitter planning. Daniel's desperate purchase. Leo's curious discovery. Frank's careful conversion. The years of patient work that transformed found fortune into lasting stability. The land held those stories the way it held rain and seasons, without judgment, simply witnessing what humans chose to build on its surface. And tomorrow the land would still be there, ready for whatever came next, holding its secrets and its memories while life continued above. Patient as only earth can be, knowing that people come and go but the ground remains, unchanged in its fundamental nature, forever ready to give back what it's been given when the time comes and the right person finally learns to listen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. 10 years after purchasing the dairy farm for $380, Daniel Cortez stood in the eastern field watching the August sun climb above the tree line. The land had changed in ways both visible and subtle. Where thistle and wild grass once choked the soil, native prairie flowers now grew in deliberate wildness, planted 3 years ago with help from the County Conservation District. The old dairy barns had been reinforced and repurposed, one housing Daniel's welding workshop, another converted into a community space where local craftspeople gathered monthly to share skills and stories. Leo had left for college 2 years earlier, studying architecture at a university downstate. He came home for holidays and summers, bringing friends who marveled at the property's history without knowing its deepest secrets. The vault remained sealed, empty now except for Vincent's journal, which Daniel had returned to its original resting place. Some things belonged in darkness, preserved rather than displayed. Daniel was 44 now, silver threading through his hair at the temples, his hands bearing scars from a decade of welding and farm work. He'd never remarried after Carla, though he'd dated occasionally, careful relationships that respected his need for privacy and his devotion to the property. The farm had become his companion in ways that surprised him, its rhythms and demands providing structure to days that might otherwise feel empty with Leo grown and gone. Frank Brennan had become something like family over the years. He visited several times annually, his book's success having led to speaking engagements and academic appointments. They'd developed an easy friendship built on shared secrets and mutual respect. Frank's 20% of Vincent's fortune had allowed him to establish a foundation documenting rural crime history in the Midwest, work that honored his grandfather's era without glorifying its methods. The money itself had settled into normalcy over a decade. The initial shock of wealth had faded into quiet security, investments managed by professionals Frank had recommended, income flowing steadily without requiring Daniel's attention. He lived modestly by billionaire standards, his greatest luxury being the freedom to choose his work and protect his time. The welding jobs he took now were purely artistic, sculptures and custom pieces for clients who appreciated craftsmanship over speed. The farmhouse had been fully restored, room by room over the years. Original wood floors refinished, plaster repaired, windows replaced with period-appropriate reproductions. Daniel had honored the building's history while making it functional, preserving Vincent's era while adapting for modern comfort. Visitors commented on the house's character, the way it felt both old and alive, as if generations of stories had soaked into its walls. Pete Holloway had become a regular presence before his death 3 years ago, the old hardware store owner finally admitting his connection to Vincent's operations. He'd been a driver, moving goods between Chicago and rural drop points, paid well for his discretion and reliability. In his final months, Pete had shared stories about Vincent that weren't in any journal, painting a more complete picture of the man who'd built this place. Vincent wasn't cruel, Pete had said, sitting on Daniel's porch one autumn evening. But he was hard. Demanded perfection, rewarded loyalty, punished mistakes. He loved his wife deeply, loved his sons in his way. But he couldn't respect them. That ate at him, knowing his own blood lacked the qualities he valued. Made him bitter toward the end. Did he ever talk about the vault? Daniel had asked. Pete had smiled at that. Never directly. But one night, drunk on whiskey after his wife's funeral, he said something I never forgot. Said the land remembers everything we give it, good and bad. Said he'd buried his life's work where only someone patient would find it. Thought he was being metaphorical about his dairy operation. Guess he was more literal than I knew. That conversation had stayed with Daniel, reshaping his understanding of Vincent's intentions. The vault hadn't been just about hiding wealth or punishing unworthy heirs. It had been about testing patience, about ensuring whoever found the fortune would have invested enough time in the property to appreciate what Vincent had built beyond just money. The dairy farm itself, the land, the careful construction, the decades of work maintaining appearances while facilitating operations. That was Vincent's real legacy, and the fortune was simply his way of rewarding someone who'd recognize it. Daniel had tried explaining this to Leo during one of his son's visits home, but Leo had understood intuitively in ways that made Daniel proud. The money matters less than what you did with it, Leo had said. Grandpa Vincent, that's what I call him now, he wanted someone who'd actually live here, actually care about the place. You did that before you found the vault. The fortune just made it possible to do it right. The community had integrated Daniel into their fabric over the decade, no longer seeing him as an outsider who'd bought the Brennan place but as someone who belonged. He served on the county conservation board, taught welding classes at the regional high school, sponsored scholarships for rural students pursuing trades. None of this was flashy or drew attention to his wealth. It was simply what someone did when they had resources and cared about their community. The secret of the vault's discovery remained known only to Daniel, Leo, and Frank. Not even Leo's closest friends knew the true source of their transformed circumstances, believing instead the official story of a successful lawsuit settlement from the factory closure that had cost Daniel his job. The lie was simple enough to be believable, boring enough to discourage questions. On this August morning, Daniel walked the property's perimeter as he did most days, following paths he'd worn into the earth over a decade of routine. The eastern marker stone still stood where Vincent had used it for his first cache, though the hole Daniel had dug was long filled and overgrown. The land had reclaimed its secrets, showing no evidence of what had been buried and recovered. He reached the small cemetery where Vincent and his wife rested, stones clean and straight from Daniel's regular maintenance. Fresh flowers sat in holders Daniel had welded from scrap metal, simple but elegant, changed weekly throughout the growing season. "Morning," Daniel said to the graves, his ritual greeting. "Property's doing well. Leo's coming home this weekend, bringing someone he wants us to meet. Girl he's been seeing, architect major like him. Thought you'd appreciate knowing your farm is going to be in good hands for another generation." The wind moved through the cemetery trees, carrying the smell of late summer and the distant promise of autumn. Daniel stood quietly, feeling the weight of a decade's choices, the complex legacy he'd inherited and transformed. "I think I finally understand what you wanted," Daniel said to Vincent's grave. "Not just for someone to find the money. You wanted someone to appreciate what you built, the whole thing. The farm, the patience, the careful planning. You wanted someone who'd see the value in ordinary things done extraordinarily well. I hope I've honored that." He stayed a few minutes longer, then walked back toward the farmhouse, where work waited. A commission from a client in Chicago, an abstract sculpture that would challenge his skills and pay well enough to fund 3 more scholarships for rural students. Leo arrived that Friday evening driving the sensible used truck Daniel had bought him for college, a young woman named Sarah in the passenger seat. She was tall and confident, with the practical bearing of someone who'd grown up working with her hands. Over dinner, she explained her family ran a small farm in southern Illinois, that she'd gone to architecture school specifically to learn how to help rural communities adapt old buildings for new purposes. "Your dad's doing exactly what I want to help others do," Sarah told Leo, gesturing around the restored farmhouse. "Taking something everyone else saw as worthless and revealing its value. This house has another century in it easy, maybe 2, because he respected what it was while making it what it needed to become." Daniel felt his throat tighten at her understanding. Leo had chosen well, found someone who saw the world through similar eyes, who valued patience and craft over speed and profit. Later, after Sarah had gone to bed in the guest room, Leo and Daniel sat on the porch in comfortable silence. The August night was warm, stars visible in ways they never had been in the city where Leo went to school. "I'm going to marry her," Leo said quietly. "Not right away, we're both finishing school. But eventually. Wanted you to know, wanted to bring her here so she could see where I came from. What shaped me." Daniel nodded, emotion making words difficult. "She's good. Smart. Sees things clearly. She reminds me of Mom," Leo said. "Not in looks, but in how she thinks. Practical but dreaming big. Mom would have liked her." "Your mom would have loved her," Daniel agreed. "Would have loved seeing you this happy." They sat in silence for a while, then Leo asked, "Do you ever regret it? The vault, the money, the deal with Frank? Sometimes I wonder if keeping it all would have been simpler." Daniel considered this carefully. "Simpler, maybe. But not better. Sharing with Frank kept us safe, gave us an ally who understood the complications. And honestly, 60 million is more than enough. What would we do with 85? Buy things we don't need? The money's purpose is to give us freedom, and we have that. Everything else would just be burden." Leo absorbed this, then said, "I want to come back here eventually. After school, after working for a few years. Want to build a house on the property, raise kids here if Sarah agrees. This place, it's in me now. Can't imagine being anywhere else long-term." Daniel felt gratitude so profound it ached. "I'd like that. This place needs young energy. Needs to be more than just an old man's project." "You're not old," Leo said, smiling. "You're barely 44. "Old enough to know what matters," Daniel replied. "Old enough to want to see grandkids running through these fields someday." The weekend passed in easy companionship, Sarah fitting into their rhythm as if she'd always been there. She asked questions about the property's history, listened intently to stories about Vincent's dairy operation without knowing about the criminal connections or hidden fortune. Some truths could wait for marriage, for family, for the right time when secrets became legacy rather than burden. After they left Sunday evening, Daniel walked to the tunnel entrance in the farmhouse pantry. He hadn't opened it in years, the hidden door sealed and camouflaged again. But knowing it was there, knowing what it had held, that knowledge had become part of the property's identity for him. The farm wasn't just land and buildings. It was layers of history, secrets revealed and secrets kept, Vincent's bitter planning and Daniel's desperate purchase and Leo's curious discovery all compressed into soil and stone and story. He thought about opening the door, descending one more time to the empty vault where Vincent's journal waited. But the impulse passed. Some places were meant to stay closed, their purpose fulfilled, their secrets spent. Instead, Daniel returned to his workshop and worked on the Chicago Commission until late, the familiar rhythm of welding meditative and satisfying. Creating something from raw materials, transforming metal through heat and skill into forms that carried meaning. It wasn't so different from what Vincent had done with the farm, or what Daniel was doing with the fortune. Taking what others saw as worthless and revealing its value through patience and vision. The years continued their steady progression. Leo graduated, married Sarah in a ceremony held in the eastern field where prairie flowers bloomed. They worked for architectural firms in different cities, building careers and reputation. Daniel aged gracefully into his 50s, his work evolving toward larger sculptural installations that began attracting regional attention. The dairy farm became known not as the old Brennan place but as the Cortez property, where community events happened and young people learned trades and the land was tended with respect. Frank visited less frequently as his own health declined, but their friendship remained constant. He'd completed 3 books documenting rural crime history, each one honoring Vincent's era without revealing the vault's existence. In his final visit before his death at 72, Frank stood with Daniel at Vincent's grave and spoke words Daniel would remember forever. "My grandfather was a complicated man," Frank said. "Criminal, certainly. But also someone who understood that legacy means more than blood. He built something here that outlasted his disappointments, something that found its way to people who'd appreciate it. I'm grateful he did, grateful you shared it with me, grateful we both tried to honor what he wanted even when we didn't fully understand it." After Frank's death, Daniel received notification that Frank had left his portion of Vincent's fortune, grown significantly through careful investment, to the foundation documenting rural history. The gift would fund research and preservation for decades, ensuring Vincent's era was remembered honestly rather than romanticized or forgotten. Daniel was 60 when Leo and Sarah finally returned to build their house on the property. They chose a spot on the western edge, far enough from the original farmhouse to feel separate but close enough to remain connected. The house they designed honored the farm's history while embracing modern efficiency, a structure that would age gracefully and serve generations. Their first child, a daughter they named Carla, was born the following spring. Daniel held his granddaughter on the farmhouse porch and felt time fold in on itself, seeing Carla's eyes in this new face, understanding that legacy wasn't about money or property but about love passed forward through generations. Leo never asked if he could tell Sarah about the vault. Some understanding had developed between father and son, an agreement that certain secrets belonged to those who discovered them, protected them, transformed them into something good. Sarah knew the farm had provided for them somehow, knew Daniel's resources exceeded what a welder should have accumulated. But she didn't push for details, accepting that every family had private histories. Daniel was 65 on a November morning when he walked to the cemetery and found someone had left flowers at Vincent's grave. Not the ones Daniel regularly placed, but wildflowers gathered from the fields, tied with twine. He looked around, seeing no one, then noticed small footprints in the soft earth. Child-sized. His granddaughter, maybe, though she was only 5. or perhaps the land itself offering acknowledgement, though Daniel knew better than to believe in such magic. Still, it felt right that Vincent should receive flowers from unknown hands, recognition from the property he'd built and hidden and ultimately passed to strangers who'd become family. Daniel knelt slowly, his knees protesting age, and straightened the wildflowers. "Thank you," he said to Vincent, to the land, to whatever forces had brought him here 15 years ago desperate and broke. "Thank you for trusting the future more than you trusted your blood. Thank you for building something that could be found by someone who'd appreciate it." The November wind answered, moving through bare branches and dried grass, carrying the smell of earth preparing for winter. The land that had kept secrets for decades, that had witnessed Vincent's bitter planning and Daniel's desperate arrival and Leo's curious discovery. The land that remained constant while everything else changed, holding all of it without judgment, simply existing as the foundation on which human drama played out. Daniel stood slowly and walked back toward the farmhouse, where Sarah would have lunch ready and little Carla would demand stories about when Grandpa first came to the farm. He'd tell her edited versions, tales of finding a secret door and fixing an old house, adventures that were true without revealing everything. Someday, maybe, when she was older, Leo would decide what to share. But for now, let her childhood be simple, filled with the magic of old farms and hidden rooms without the weight of complicated wealth. The dairy farm stretched around him in all directions, transformed but recognizable, Vincent's legacy and Daniel's stewardship and Leo's future all layered into soil and stone. A place where rural stories rose, where roots ran deep, where legacy was never taken for granted. A place that remembered everything given to it and gave back when the time came and the right person learned to listen. Daniel reached the farmhouse and climbed the porch steps, feeling the solid wood beneath his feet, hearing Carla's laughter from inside. The land had decided, finally, that it had given enough. And Daniel had proven worthy by building forward rather than looking back, by sharing rather than hoarding, by understanding that the greatest legacy wasn't what you kept but what you passed on transformed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.